Hello and welcome back. This is part 2. Europeans had a sense of freedom and democracy. They wrote about it, talked about it, idealized it, attempted it, lost it for several hundred years. Then it was rediscovered. The truth is, at no time ever in any historical era was democracy and freedom ever truly realized, and that remains to be true to this day. In a slave society, hierarchy and centralized power base, authoritarianism is necessary. Freedom was granted piecemeal through promotions by higher classes, so it wasn't really freedom. One was just entitled to more than another. Slavery is the enduring legacy of Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Far East. But it ends at the Bering Strait. All language, culture, tradition, religion, government developed within slavery dynamics. All perception of reality was based within alienation. Only 39 years had passed since the fall of the Roman Empire, when colonization began in North and South America. Were it not for colonization, empires likely would not come to understand freedom and independence, democracy, constitutional law, human and equality rights. Historians have reported that Europeans recorded and noted the vastly superior health and well-being of the American Indian, who lived at times over 150 years old, compared to the European life expectancy of at most 35 years old. Life in the empires was apparently quite desperate, short, and painful, with misery and suffering every single day, even among the upper classes not much better off than the common folk. The norm in imperialist Europe was the criminal and the sadist. Imperialists wrote about the freedom and independence of the Indian, noted with envy. A favorite image of the North and South American Indian was how proud they were. The empires couldn't prevent their own people from escaping, so they could live with American Indians, free and independent in the true sense, with no bosses, no taxes to pay, no law to rule over them. 284 years would pass before Thomas Jefferson would write the Declaration of Independence and base it largely on 284 years of relations, including help from the American Indians to survive a single winter. Americans now celebrate Thanksgiving dinner today, largely unaware of how close their ancestors came to starving to death. The American Indians shared knowledge of medicine, traditional teachings, and later the great law of peace. If European empires had never met Indians and other indigenous groups around the world, they would never have been so enriched with concepts of dignity and self-respect and self-worth. Despite what American Indians contributed to humanity in terms of democracy, freedom, and independence, empires remain stubbornly enslaved. Democracy practiced today has trouble following their own constitution and international law. Children continue to be born alienated, systemically discriminated, existing in morally depraved societies, perpetuating racism and slave conditions, including all members of the white races. The reason why indigenous people experience totalitarianism today is because Pope Alexander VI issued bulls of 1493, determined the Amerindian was a pagan and thus not human, therefore had no rights or sovereignty. This was common practice at the time, which is how Ireland came under the rule of England in 1156, according to Dickinson in Myth of the Savage. With sweeping statements and gross generalizations, with power and authority sinfully inconsiderate of crimes against humanity, we live through papal bulls, royal proclamations, international and national law and treaty. How do we undo the tradition of 10,000 years of slavery? This was a belief system codified in Canadian law, the Indian Act, which we live with today under totalitarian, absolutist rule, an outdated, outmoded way of thinking. How do belief systems remain stubbornly ensconced in the minds of some people for over 10,000 years? Sam Vaknin's tome on Narcissism, revisited 10th edition, describes narcissistic personality disorder with titanic detail, but he also describes how all modern human races practice narcissism, and some more than others. Our children are born into self-righteousness, a world modeled after popes, monarchs, presidents, senators, ministers, chancellors. Such a legacy is one that disapproves a person's worth and dignity with ceaseless torments, insults, deprivations, measurements so high our kids must reinvent themselves. No human can meet those standards without imagination. As our children develop, they look at other people through various interactions in public education, health, housing, social services. They see how others see them, which comes in the form of approval or disapproval, and they modify themselves to fit in to situations and circumstances, with families or without, some raised by social workers. People are the mirror through which we see ourselves. Our real selves are never good enough, and so we internalize what we have experienced, believing that we are who we think we are based on the reflection, the gaze of the imagination and fantasy. Our true selves are never realized. We are never good enough for society's standards, and so our true selves are suppressed into the subconscious, locked inside of our head. What is presented to others is a false self, a part of our own creation for the world's approval, a modified self. A fake is projected onto others by approval and disapproval, reflected back in reinforcement. Our carefully constructed self is not who we truly are. It is a socialized person, an assimilation, a mask. An assimilated person is an enslaved person bound by rules, a trained animal, a person who is willing to sacrifice their own dignity for immediate gratification, wealth, and fame, even if it is imaginary. The assimilated, enslaved, are everywhere and in everyone. They are at the lowest classes of society, the homeless, poor, all the way up to the highest classes of society, including police, lawyers, judges, religious people, politicians. But the ones in positions of power are the most self-righteous. This includes the white man from town and his Karen. If you have ever adjusted yourself to accommodate other people's insecurities and anxieties to fit in, then you are not an authentic self. Early in your development, you were told you were worthless, and in your innocence you believed it. If you have done it once, you would be willing to repeat your accommodations until eventually your true self becomes locked away in the depths of the darkest places of your subconscious in shame. This is all the empire has ever known. It is the only way that an empire can be an empire. It's a conundrum. The following stories we will explore together will determine if this mystery can be solved. As for the storyteller, I already know the ending, and I think you will like how it ends. We will look at each other and discover who is narcissist, or if we both are. If one of us is narcissist, or both, Sam Vaknin and all other psychologists say that our recovery from ourselves is highly unlikely. We shall see who is a slave and who is free, learn about the history of democracy, human and equality rights, law, justice, and finally to learn for ourselves if the system is working the way it was designed. Thank you once again for your time and consideration.